So really today we're going to be talking about enterprise voice, the implementation, some best practices, some opportunities that there are to expand capabilities off of existing legacy PBX voice applications, as well as to do some integration for survivable branch exchanges, appliances, and then move some other frameworks. The folks in the room that are from not some of our partners, how many here actually deployed enterprise voice so far? All right. Okay, good. So we'll talk through that, walk through some of those options. Since it's a relatively intimate affair, ask as many questions as you like. This won't be too painful. We'll run through quite a bit here as we get going. So, as we really talk about enterprise voice, it's kind of interesting. This show in particular, enterprise voice seems to be one of the primary focuses that most of the partners here are talking about. Lots of manufacturers that are phone-related, gateways, SBCs, services as well. We're talking about best practices, potentially best hardware, and when to use it in what situation, and then best financial options. So this is part of the, quote, business track. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that at the end, some options you have, the ways in which to leverage bundling service as well as hardware solutions to reduce overall capital expense and be able to do some other things. We'll also talk at the end about what SoTel does, just a little bit to give you a sense of why it is you should even have listened to us for the last hour and 15 minutes. But we'll run through there. So really, it's interesting. One of the biggest questions we have in this presentation that, when we normally give this, it's not an environment where people are coming wanting to listen to Lync per se. This is usually one of our introductory questions, right? Is because they think of it a lot as messaging and focusing a lot on messaging right off the bat. So from a messaging perspective, we have quite a bit of focus on whether or not you can expand messaging and put it forward instead of and actually using voice proper. So there we go. It's a 64 gig version too, so if anybody cares. So really the answer is yes, you can end up ordering pizza with Lync, and not simply by just sending them a message, but you can actually pick up the phone and call them. We'll talk a little bit about the way that you can work through that. One of the most important things too from a business perspective is still the question of whether or not you have VoIP adoption. I talked to 2 or 3 different large enterprises that are still trying to decide whether or not to transition existing enterprise voice applications, which are on competitors not to be named, but there are only 2 or 3, some of them which actually are still using an extraordinary number of digital handsets, especially in the medical environment. We see a lot of that, and then also in the university environment where you're still looking at a lot of dormitories or professor office phones that may not have any features required, but just really need dial tone going to the edge. One of the important things to note is that we will be beyond that curve in 2016. The expectation is that most enterprises, those above 250 seats, will have a significant and substantial portion of their infrastructure moving to IP voice, whether it be via Lync or any other platform. So from that perspective, it's going to become much more difficult and harder to find solutions that are just supporting a digital only or even an analog environment, which we find with some of our customers as we talk to them. We're going to talk a little bit about Lync options for premise-based or even hosted Lync voice. Talk about it in relationship to Office 365 and how we can actually move from there if you're in a hosted environment. The PSTN connection for both inbound and outbound. We find customers that are using Lync with enterprise voice with our services, both either from a SIP trunking perspective as well as a hardware solution with a combination of phones and headsets being a significant piece. And then we're also talk just for a minute about internal only. So you have 2 different applications, right? You have one which can be just that solution that is allowing you to actually order that pizza via the PSTN, and then as well on the internal side, node to node, and being able to make sure that that works. There is a business case to be made to doing your voice communications via Lync in an enterprise voice environment with yet not connecting to PSTN. It may be a situation, we've talked to several customers like this, that already have or in the middle of a long-term professional services contract on their current enterprise PBX infrastructure, may not have the ability to transition yet, or the money's already been spent, or it's already been budgeted for the next couple of years. So we find in a lot of cases where it still may make sense to look at the appliances and hardware necessary to go ahead and put those, put the internal node solution together. Experience tells us when we're working with folks, and we end up kind of catching falling knives a lot, and it's kind of anytime you're in an early adoption phase like this, sometimes we'll have customers come to us after they've started something that has gone horribly wrong. And so one of the some key elements of our experience has been that you need to use both qualified hardware and a qualified service provider. There are a lot of folks out there that talk about service as being qualified. One of the 911 providers was just in here talking to me a few minutes ago, and we found that one of the issues that seems to be even on 911 handling is that you can have someone that actually is handling SIP for you directly that may not be a qualified vendor, but the 911 passing is actually having to be mediated by the service provider, and that's a dangerous place to be, where they're actually having to rewrite your 911 messages. That's something you don't want to do if you can help it. You don't want to have somebody calling for help and somebody's database is wrong and ends up sending an ambulance to the wrong place. When you really look at it, examples of some solutions, really, when you look at Lync itself, you really need to focus on an SBC or a gateway solution that is qualified. Just an example, a couple of products that we have a lot of experience with, and we'll be talking about some of the Sangoma products a little bit through this, just as an example of some solutions, because it puts a nice package together, and we're seeing some uptake on that, and then directly to PSTN SIP trunking. One of the most important pieces you want to focus on if you are moving is the testing side of things. We're finding that some of the reasons that folks have gotten into the mess that they're in sometimes in the last year and a half is they will have jumped in. They will have a trusted advisor that they may have used for 15 years on one side of their business that says, yep, I can do Lync. They have not yet had the experience or certifications to do so. They run through, and all of a sudden you find yourself in some trouble. The testing piece of itself, there are a couple of things. It's not just testing for the SIP trunking portion or testing for the hardware. One of the most important things, and we find this a lot, we'll talk about something called rolling chair syndrome a few slides in, but testing is really important on what type of endpoints you want to end up having your end user use. You need to actually put in place a test case that actually has them using the new handsets, just like you would if you were moving in the old days from an old Nortel platform to an Ericsson platform. You would still want to make sure that you had a test bed of handsets they were actually able to use, feel, taste, touch, because the reality is it doesn't matter what is behind in the server cabinet. If they don't like the way the phone works, it's hell on the person trying to actually implement the phone system. So you need to make sure that's actually in place. The other portion is headsets. So there are lots and lots of headsets out there. We actually handle both the Plantronics and the Jabra headsets, both of which Lync qualified. We have a lot of experience rolling these out. This is a little bit, in a few slides, we'll talk about rolling chair syndrome for people who may not experience this. We hear a lot, we've heard a lot this last few days about folks who are saying, it's great, we're going to be able to move to headsets only. Okay, let's try that. So what happens is that oftentimes you'll end up having users figure out a way where the headsets won't work for the particular application, demand their phone back, figure out a way. And it's the easiest way to begin to have an implementation, especially of a new voice platform, break down when the end user doesn't like the device they're using overall. And then the other portion then on the testing side is making sure that all pieces actually flow through. I mentioned 911 before. One of the important pieces of using qualified hardware is making sure that you have all of the signaling pass, and the hardware is expecting that signaling to pass, and then also on the SIP trunking side, making sure that you're able to pass that information all the way to whoever is handling the 911 solution behind it. So there's great ways we can actually test a full implementation. And here's one of the interesting parts of what we have found is that there are a few cases out there and that people have downloaded, and there's some PowerPoint presentations, PDFs of exactly how you're supposed to test. There are all kinds of ways you could test. And you can test end-to-end all the way to the user endpoint. And the important reason to talk about this is that everyone's implementation at this stage of the game is different. Some people have just thrown up a server to try and test to see whether or not the thing will just turn up, what the interface is like, how the admin functions work. And you want to be able to see, hey, will voice work over this? Or you'll have folks that already have a full-blown implementation for messaging, Maybe they're moving from 2010 to 2013. In this situation, you need to be able to have a solution that actually meets the security framework. So some of the ways that we can test SIP trunking so you can give an end-to-end enterprise voice solution. So no matter what phase you're in today, do it if you're behind the firewall, directly through. So we can end up handling NAT as it comes through. If you happen to be in front of the firewall, we can connect to the public side of the mediation server. We actually provide an SBC in the cloud function. We'll talk a little bit about SBCs, and if you don't know how to, yeah, we'll make sure you can spell SBC by the time you leave the room. But the SBC side of things, a lot of times that portion to do the mediation of the signaling for Lync is important to have in the mix. And if you don't have it on site or you haven't yet made the investment on site, we can, in a testing environment only, we wouldn't suggest this in production right off the bat. There are ways you could do it in production, but we wouldn't suggest it, that you'd be able to go ahead and roll this out with our SBC in the cloud instance for you and be able to put that in place. There's the transparent view, where in a firewall situation, if you're just putting you have your mediation server in a DMZ situation, we can pass the traffic directly there, or directly to your great old SBC. So we can go ahead and put your session border controller directly connected to SIP. Now, one of the important things about this is, and using what we believe it's important, and there are others out there like this, that can do SIP trunking and the hardware portion, is that you have one throat to choke as far as the integration piece. You can go out and bid out all the pieces after the fact, but when you're going through the stages of trying to figure out how things work, it's going to shortcut quite a bit, being able to get you into a position where you're able to see how this functions. So when you come to someone like us, you can get multiple SBC flavors, multiple gateway flavors, multiple phone and headset flavors, as well as then make sure on the SIP trunking side we can test multiple configurations to make sure that it's going to meet whatever your security needs happen to be. So here's get more into the weeds a little bit, just to kind of give you a sense of it. And this is supposed to be a business level discussion, so we're going to talk a little bit on why it may make sense to do some of these things from a business perspective. So one is, let me see if you guys can see the laser pointer. From a private IP address perspective, you can end up having, this is kind of a classic solution, right? So you end up having a private IP address, you have your Lync server in some secure environment, right? It's already behind all of the infrastructure. You end up having your firewall with public IP, and then we can end up having the SIP trunking solution here. This is does not require an SBC to do some testing in this instance, where you actually have the ability to do NAT, network address translation, if the service provider supports that, through the firewall off to the Lync server. So if you're already in a position where you've got some messaging in place, you're doing messaging between multiple locations, you're able to go ahead and work through that. So on the public IP address, one of the options here is to go ahead and push the SIP trunking directly through the firewall, just simply exposing the Lync server behind it. Again, that's more if you're in a testing phase. You haven't deployed it in production yet. You're just in a place where you want to be able to see whether or not the voice traffic is going to flow without putting all of the effect in place. In fact, this is the way we initially qualified, interestingly enough, with to do the Microsoft qualification. So this is not one that is ever recommended, but this is actually the way in which the qualification occurred, because we did it early, and so that's kind of one of those ways that you had to make sure the signaling was functioning. Then you have without firewall, so you could end up in a situation where the firewall's here, you end up with the Lync server in front of it, and then the connection. This is the situation where the SBC either has to sit at the customer prim, but if you haven't invested in one yet, or you're still evaluating what you want to use, or the number of sessions you want to deploy, we can go ahead and do the SBC functionality in the cloud. There are others that can do this as well, but this is something you should look at from a testing perspective and make sure that you can test all of these options. Because it's possible that you could be in a situation where you can have a main installation. There are situations where this can actually be in production. And the way that this would work is that in a disaster recovery situation or in a branch environment where you've got very few users at the edge, you could be in a situation where this type of configuration is possible to be used. So then you end up with certified SBC. One of the benefits here is that you end up with the server connected to the certified SBC, whatever it might be, directly to SIP trunking. At this point, you may have all types of different security infrastructure at this level, or even at this level, depending on what your infrastructure is. If anybody's trying to figure out what kind of firewall they want to use for enterprise voice or SIP trunking, I won't mention their name in the room, but don't use the one that says that they're built for SIP trunking. We'll talk about those. Feel free to stop by the booth because it doesn't work. It will be the most horrible experience of your life because the service provider will tell you, oh, your firewall needs to be changed. It starts with an S, ends with an L. So you end up with connect mediation server to qualified SBC here, and then you end up with instant cost savings. The reason I put that in place is that you can actually, right off the bat, if you can get your, what we find oftentimes from an evolution standpoint and begin to actually get some return on investment, is that in large enterprises, it's very easy to begin to shunt traffic over into a different platform for the purpose of PSTN long-distance termination. So you can begin to start to realize some savings immediately just by moving some of the SIP trunking off to that. It's possible you can have some toll-free traffic that's coming in, start managing it off so you can start moving it slowly. And a lot of what we do and some of the implementations that we've had with some of the partners we work with, actually changing over, if you're transitioning from, for example, an Avaya platform that happens to have a DS3's worth of PRI in place, 28 PRI or so in place, we can start to move over specific units. And we actually also then provide, through our partners, the ability to manage the dial plan through a gateway. So you can put a gateway in place, have both of them be able to talk to each other, and start to manage that transition gracefully. So you're not sitting in a situation where you have to cut it immediately. Okay, here's the small slide. So everybody put on their glasses if they need it. We'll kind of go from here. So in a Lync installation overall, right, you end up having your, and thanks to our friends at Sangoma for putting this slide together. This was great. So you have your applications as they are, your Active Directory server, and then also users, server, mediation server at one side. At the point you actually then want to connect into however you're actually managing the firewall. So say your firewall instance is here, all of your activity here along with the mediation server. Your DMZ with the SBC and a VoIP gateway. These are options for the voice side. You would also normally see your edge server and your reverse proxy sitting there. For those of you who are simply on the business side and may not have the entire piece of this in your head or haven't quite implemented yet, really, you've got all the user apps, you've got the transaction, and then soon over here you'll have the destination, right? So in the sense where you've got the VoIP gateway, you could have a situation where today you have PRI and you're under contract for another 2 years. So in that situation, you've got an option to go ahead and connect SIP via the gateway and then directly into in this environment. But based on how the SBC is structured, or whether or not its appliance can do both, you can then also, when we see a lot of customers beginning to do this, especially those, it's kind of interesting. A year ago, a lot of the user profile for Lync was really that sub 250 group. We saw a lot of folks that were just trying, just kind of getting in place, and they were the ones implementing first, because of course those with larger installations just take longer to evaluate and get there. So what we were seeing is that initially people with 1 or 2 PRI that they may still be under contract with, they would go ahead and move over their SIP traffic for PSTN and toll-free, keep their local stuff on the PRI to maintain their contracts, but still end up saving money overall in the way the structure, usually their telecom bills will work. And they've already started to pay for the infrastructure for both gateway and the SBC side of things. If you go straight to an SBC, you can, of course, go straight to SIP trunks. As we talked about, this is all the user side over here. The actual appliances allowed to actually the users interact with. The DMZ in and of itself, of course, that's because they're behind that portion of the firewall. You have then the rest of the world here, remote users, Office 365, whatever it might be, on this side of things. This is the general large architecture. We're going to dive down into a couple of specific significant sections. Anybody have any questions? Just simply holler. In fact, questions? All right. So here's an example of an elegant, what we believe to be an elegant PBX transition. So you end up with, for example, Lync endpoint, telephone, and SIP trunking. Those 3 things exist in the world. You have to figure out a way to actually put them all together. So you have your PBX, whatever it might be. It can be, in a very small location, it could be an old North Star, or it could be an option 11, or it could be I can't tell you how many people I talked to in the last 24 hours or 36 hours that they're trying to figure out a way to transition from still a Nortel platform or even an existing Avaya platform that they're trying to transition from. And then there's the 10-year-old call managers out there. So those seem to be the hit parade right now as far as trying to figure out the next steps from a transition standpoint. In this environment, we talk about this in two ways. There's a product that we represent that's called Lync Express that allows of some freedom and flexibility initially. And then we're also going to talk about this in terms of if this wasn't the Lync Express. That's why it's just the gray box. We can talk about it in terms of however you want to deploy it. But from a Lync endpoint perspective, there's my laser. You end up going through the Lync server, the mediation server itself. Active Directory is all working. And this happens to be in a situation where you can either have independent SBCs and gateways, and there are good reasons to have independent units depending on the size of the installation and the level of support and capability you have in your information technology group. But if you don't have that level of support or you have a branch environment, then you can actually have all of these things, including the gateway, SBC, the Active Directory server, mediation server, and Lync server, all in a single 1 or 2U application. So it actually gives you the capability to deploy that, usually at a cost significantly less and an integration expense quite a bit less as well. The benefit of that is you're taking 5 elements that usually require expertise at all 5 levels, and they are rolled into a single device with a single user interface. So it changes the game a bit on the ability and the speed to which to deploy. This also allows you, and one of the reasons we want to talk about this in particular is on the testing side of things, you can roll this out and actually be able to test real Lync experience. All you need is your own licenses that you're already working with your Microsoft rep for to apply to the box and go ahead and push it out. So it really allows you to take a laboratory environment, deploy it, be able to see all of the function and feature functionality, and then roll out your own infrastructure based on your experience on the Lync Express. So it goes up to 1,000 users. Most of the folks that we're talking to here are way beyond that, but in a branch server environment, it may be applicable. But this allows you to, for very inexpensively, put a full qualified system, a Lync qualified system in place that has all the features and functionalities you need to test how you want to do the end-to-end solution. An example of how this works from Office 365. So we have the next set of users, right? I'm talking about a lot of these guys that I've talked to in the last few days, relatively large. The next most common set in the last couple of days has been folks who are either in Lync Online with an Office 365-like solution. They have a hosted solution somewhere, trying to figure out a way to integrate voice to that solution. Now, there are some things we know from a Microsoft perspective, if it's part of the Microsoft ecosystem, that will be coming out over the next couple of years. But there's some people may not want that level of control for the voice side. If that's the case, there are a couple of options for you. So, and particularly with the Lync Express, but you can take all the elements of Lync Express and also deploy it in this way as well. So if you have your local user, your Office 365 user, and the internet in between, you end up with the following elements as they flow. So you end up with, and this is a little bit more complex than the last slide, but generally all of these functions, mediation server again, Lync server, the edge server, reverse proxy, the SBC, and the gateway. So again, you can have existing PRI connected to it. You can have SIP trunking connected to it. All of the functions you would normally do for voice, all in the single appliance, and then have Active Directory running back to and syncing with the Office 365 element, and then have all of that with the Office 365 user going back down and being able to use voice back through this solution entirely. This is one of the most common ways today that this particular appliance is being used with the opportunities that we're seeing at the moment. It's part of that, as I mentioned a year ago, almost everybody was sub 250, and then now they're growing. That sub 250 group, they're kind of growing up, and some of them went off and did the Office 365 thing, did not apply voice just yet. They're trying to figure out now, because they've embedded themselves into the Lync environment so heavily, how to go ahead and extend voice through that. Another example here, as far as being able to deploy as a survivable branch server. So you have all of the primary elements that we have just talked about in the solution in HQ environment. So you have your normal Lync installation across the environment, you have the WAN solution, and then example, Lync Express, or again, all of these elements can be independent on the site. But this allows you to, if you do use a Lync Express solution, to have a single unified UI to be able to allow 50, 60, 75, 100 locations be able to be managed all with the same type of infrastructure, rather than trying to worry about versioning, worrying about whether or not, you know, your dual power supply, one of them went out on whatever server you happen to have out in the field, and pulling all of that back. So again, you know, we talked a little bit about Lync Express. It encompasses all of these things. So it's Windows Server 2012 with Active Directory, reverse proxy, an Edge server, 2013 server, mediation, gateway, and SBC, all built into a single box. So it allows you to go ahead and, again, sub-1,000 user, great for a branch appliance, but especially, and what we're seeing a lot of, especially good for large enterprises who are trying to test their solution and what their structure looks like to be able to put that in place. So let's talk a little bit. Parts is parts. Anybody remembers the Wendy's commercial from years past? We're going to talk, yeah, I'm old. We've got network connectivity, SBC gateway, and user interfaces we're going to talk about next. Any other questions about basic infrastructure or SIP trunking related to Lync? Okay. So on network detail, we've got on routers and switches. You know, this really is one of the key elements that we don't talk a lot about when we're talking in the Lync environment. It's pretty critical in the way that you're actually deploying solutions. A lot of times you'll have multi-service gateways, which include a router function that some people are trying to use in some situations, especially in a survivable branch environment, and putting that in place. We believe it's really important to have routers and switches that are truly enterprise class, and you actually are able to manage very well. Some examples, Adtran, Netgear, Samsung for smaller solutions, but we really suggest that you evaluate that router solution and making sure, we've had quite a few customers with older router configurations for that are not expecting to have an extraordinary number of RTP streams running across that router, and having issues with the number of streams as they grow, because in a voice environment, packet size becomes a lot smaller, CPU requirements on router interfaces become a lot greater, and if you're in environments where you've had something that's just been chunking along and working as you expected for quite a while, you may be in a situation when you roll everything else out that you're introducing some things like jitter and potentially even packet loss, depending on the level of impact to the CPU as you're pushing it through the systems. A lot of people don't have problems with this, but we do have some customers who are just running on 5 to 7 year old gear. So we talked a little bit about the PSTN node interface on the SBC side of things. Between the two, again, Sangoma audio codes are ones that we focus on. On the SBC side, there are plenty of others, but not a lot more that are Lync qualified. And again, it's going to be important for you to focus on the Lync qualification side of the SBC, especially for handling mediation between SIP trunking providers. And especially, here's the key, these two in particular do well if you want to have multiple SIP trunking providers, which, just like you would in a large enterprise environment, you may end up having some PRI from one provider, some PRI from another provider. It makes complete sense to end up having a couple of SIP trunking providers for the purpose of PSTN outbound, and then also, depending on how your routing goes, with some toll-free traffic as well. So let's talk about the user interface a little bit. On the phone side of things, you've got really a mix, and I don't have the 715 on there, Tom, but it's not officially out yet. So the Polycom side of things, Snow, HP, and Astra, primarily the phone sets that are out there today. Those are the ones that we have focused on and have been out in the market. A lot of conversations have been around at the booth in the last couple of days, have been around what our experience has been at different levels over time with these phones. Love to talk to you about this. We have a lot of these phones out in the market through our reseller community. So there are a lot of different things that work, a lot of different things that don't work quite as expected, and lots of things that require potentially workarounds that are available and easy to do. So we just need to, it's a matter of expertise and helping each other as we go through the adoption phase. We're still a little bit on the early side of the curve from an enterprise voice perspective for large enterprise rollouts. We do need to make sure we're sharing as much information as possible, especially about the way endpoints interact, so that the user experience can be expected rather than having any surprises in the mix. Couple of things, and just generally, there's a lot of detail about that's not covered in this box that is different. But really, you can actually dual use those particular phones. Actually, is both for SIP and Lync. We have a lot of customers in doing initial rollouts. They want to make sure they're buying. We've had them come to us and say, "Listen, we're going down this path, but we need some insurance. So I don't want to buy a bunch of endpoints that are our only solution for a single technology." So we're having a lot of folks purchase these particular phones that allow them the flexibility to use them elsewhere if they decide to. Or if they just have, there's one client that, one end user client through a reseller that they're going through a scenario where they know where they want to go and they're going to Lync, but they're actually, with a lot of their older platforms, they're taking a SIP infrastructure they had in place, moving that down to their smaller environments, so they're not making the full investment. So that allows them to actually use now a single endpoint across all of that environment as they go ahead and transition over and they go through. But more than happy to talk to you guys a lot about phones. We push a lot of them. So here's some of the pretty pictures, right? So one of the things that has changed, and those of you who may have been an early adopter and had phones out there right away, is just the overall variety and capability of the phones that are out there. So you end up with almost everything on the page is available with a GigE switch in place. Most have actually moved on from a color screen perspective. The price points have dropped significantly as street prices have gotten a little more realistic over the last year. So you can have a phone that would have cost you in a proprietary environment. So if you were in a Cisco Avaya environment, for example, a phone that may cost you $400 to $500, same feature functionality, you may be looking at somewhere between 50 and 60% less, and still having more functionality and be able to do other things. Part of that is just the nature of Lync, the way the Lync hardware infrastructure is built, in that it's about having a set standard and having multiple partners come to the table to provide the hardware, rather than being a closed space like you would with a traditional PBX. Headsets. So before I'm going to show this slide, I'm going to tell this story. So I'm in Omaha about 18 months ago. Not quite that long, about a year ago. And go into a client. We're seeing two clients, one of which actually has rolled out about a 750 user implementation as a pilot out of about a 15,000 set deployment. And another customer that went ahead and just went all in on the admin side of the business and put about 2,200 endpoints in. So the one 750 decided, you know what, we're doing phones. It's too big of a leap to go ahead and jump all the way to the headsets. By the way, these two companies used to be the same company and split off over time, and so the IT staffs knew each other, and so one was pointing across the street and laughing at the other one. I can't believe you're doing phones. I can't believe you're doing headsets. So it was funny. The headset folks, when they made the transition, they went straight to headsets. They didn't give options like additional speakerphone connectivity for the soft phone. They did, when they went straight to headsets, they forced everyone off their phone onto their PC. And whenever you try and force a phone user, as any of you out there who may have experienced, classic telecom, putting a phone on a desk and someone complaining because a presence light isn't in one place that it used to be in another, it's the way people do business. And just when you start messing with that so extensively, bad things happen. So we ended up in a situation where we're talking to these folks who run 22 headsets, and they described what was called rolling chair syndrome. And this is where the folks that deployed the phones got the last laugh, because what happened was the folks that had the headsets, they actually started going through this process of one guy realized, hey, I accidentally rolled over my headset with my chair. Drop it on the floor, accidentally roll over. Oh, headset's gone. Third headset started to make sense that the guy got his phone. So we ended up getting a phone directly connected to the system. They were, at the time, they had some, we were providing them some test phones, and so the guy got one of the test phones and running from there. It went to the point where after 6 months, they transitioned from 100% headsets to about 85-15 phones. Just because the expectation for so long, and it depends on what part of the world you're in, right? That's also the thing. We may have some people in here from outside of North America. There seems to be more of a North American phenomenon than elsewhere when we're dealing with some folks. But just be careful forcing headsets on folks. It can be an expensive experiment. Make sure they buy in to the process. We have had another customer that did transition successfully. It was much smaller, about 45 users, but they went through an educational process with their folks and took them through, and it was slow. And they had their other PBX still up and running for a while, so it allowed them to go ahead and manage that back and forth. Yeah? Yeah.
Did you get an audible ring outside of the headset? I mean, because if you don't got your headset on, you're not looking at your screen or anything you have to call.
Yeah, so visual.
That's all they got.
That's what
I thought, because especially if you got corded headset and stuff where you're out of range.
Right.
You can't actually hear your phone ringing when you're at the desk next to you.
That's correct. So that's where you have a couple of things. Some of the presence indicators that are available out there actually have they'll flash whenever there's actually something coming in. They can actually do that as well. And then you have and then just again visually on the screen. That's part of the problem with the transition initially, right? Is that when it forced people to always have people who were not used to it, they had to have their headset on all the time, and that's just not something they were going to do. Especially in a place like Omaha, they're taking hats on and off.
Yeah, and I'm used to, like, a lot of times, it's like, I don't mind using a headset, but I don't want to wear it all day, especially if it's a wired one or something like that. But I need to hear a ring.
Right. Oh, exactly.
Because I'm not only working on my computer, I'm testing other stuff.
Sure. So, headsets are one of those things that are, potentially they're fantastic. We're selling a ton of them. But phones are currently, it was in the beginning, we saw a lot of headsets actually being pushed out for Lync solutions, probably even more so than on the handset side. We're seeing now that the people are moving to the enterprise side. Handsets are really starting to take off much greater. We had, it outstripped demand in our fourth quarter last year as far as the number of sets we were actually pushing out on that side of things. A lot of the folks in the distribution channel were taking a cautious take on stocking a lot of hardware, and it took some time, but in the middle of last year, the demand side really started to actually impact us, and we started actually moving quite a bit more. So one of the things that we've had people ask about is this trend really a trend? Are we seeing just some fits and starts of some early adoption? We're believing it is a full-blown trend into Lync. We're seeing so many larger opportunities begin to transition into production. This is not something from a telephony side that is, that is just an interrupt. This is something that actually is happening in a big way. Sure.
Your one user license will cover up to 5 devices.
Sure.
Do a SIMO ring, and you can answer the device.
Absolutely. So, for example, most of the telephony applications that we have regardless of the platform, right? So we see a lot of times office workers that are, say, in sales, that are truly administrative. You'll see those that will actually have both the headsets. So they have the freedom to get up and move about, but also then have the phone at the same time. A lot of those are still using, and a lot of the phones that we were looking at here, right, a lot of these phones will go ahead and have the headset jack directly on them as well, so you don't even have to burn a license, right? So you're going to end up just having a headset attached to the phone directly. So that's one of the freedoms that you have with these phone sets rather than you would have with with an embedded PBX that's a proprietary framework.
I was thinking it was one license that's like both users. If you have one user with a phone and a laptop, it's still only one license.
Oh, no, it is. But, I mean, you would, a number of devices, excuse me, not licenses. But no, you wouldn't burn a device that it's applied to that license, for example, if you actually used a hard-connected headset to that particular device. And you'll also find those that are in that, you'll find more cost-effective for you to actually use some of the headset options off the phone with a headset directly, rather than going with a headset that would directly connect to the PC. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about business. We're moving at a pretty good clip, so anybody have any questions at all, jump in. We're going to talk about traditional leasing, buy outright, and service bundling. There was some level of well, I'll just jump right in here real quick. So some comparison, right? Leasing, purchase, bundling, and service. All of which can be low cost. Purchase right now, the interest rates are so low, it makes a lot of sense sometimes for folks just simply to buy it, depending on the size of the environment they happen to be in. There's also this bundle service option, which is the ability for some service providers to go ahead and roll services along into the equipment and be able to provide you a single charge, basically, and keep you at the same price points that you're basically paying today for whatever hardware you might have in place. Another option, with this is paying over time. Obviously with the purchase, you could be purchasing it with some type of loan solution, but really from a lease and a bundle service perspective, that gives you that flexibility. One of the key benefits of the bundle portion is actually having the service included and keeping the service provider on the hook for providing good service. So that's one of the biggest benefits on the bundling of service piece, is that you actually have them by the, use your proverbial phrase there, but you've got them because they have to make sure that things are working all the time. Otherwise, they're going to have a big mess on their hands. Managed solution. If you're actually getting your hardware as well as your service from a single provider, they're going to make sure that things are actually working all the way through from beginning to end, and making sure that things are compatible that are being sold to you. And if not, switch them out and be able to push them from there. And in some senses, on the bundling services side, you truly are future-proof. So if for some reason there's a release that you're moving to, there's yet a different release for Lync that may have a signaling change. This actually puts you in a place where you're able to manage that all the way through the chain. Your service provider has to support that as they go. So an example on this side of things is on the capital expense side. So example, 100 users. It's a small application. Probably most of you in this room are like, 100 users. Gosh, I wish I could only deal with 100 users. But 100 users, example of 100 CX500 phones. You have about $27,000 in upfront expense, including install and professional services. That's just an example based on what we've seen. And then you probably have a couple of PRI to support that at probably about $600 a month. So in that, your total 3-year cost, if you add up everything monthly plus the initial install, is about just under $50,000, about $48,600. So then the other option is what we call So Simple. Other service providers call it other things. Our solution, again, 100 users, 100 phones, no upfront expense, and then all hardware warranties included for the life of the phrase. So you have the managed solution to have everything in place. Monthly payment overall about $1,325. That includes all your SIP trunking, includes all of that piece. So your total 3-year cost is actually less by going with a SIP solution on a bundled service than what you're able to actually do on a straight capital expense where you're writing a check, and assuming you're using PRI. So one of the things we're going to talk about here is kind of where we sit in the mix. We call our solution So Simple. And it is a little bit different than what others have done from a bundling perspective. There are some lease packages out there that do bundled service that structure with some other folks. This is something that we do that we write our own paper on. So we actually can do much larger installations and then work it from a professional services side of the equation as well. We work with Microsoft partners and then as well have our own maintenance and installation staff around the country that can then handle going out and doing truck rolls and taking care of actually setting up phones even if needed to push those around. So one of the questions, why listen to what we've been talking about? It's kind of late now. You've been stuck in here. I know the main reason is because there's a Surface sitting on the desk up here, but we've got 33 years of voice experience. We've been actually selling equipment for and services for just about 33 years. Started off primarily doing refurbishment of hardware, so we understand the nature of hardware and repair extensively. We are a Lync-in-a-box distributor, so that in and of itself means that our catalog, we have tested and qualified phones, gateways, video, and USB devices for Lync across the board. So we've taken our experience on the legacy equipment, everything from old NEC platforms to, there are new ones too, by the way, but older NEC platforms to old Nortel platforms. As a matter of fact, we support through one of our divisions Microsoft's Intercom platform that's still in Redmond that is there. We buy and replace and take care of that equipment. So we've been around for quite a while. And so we've seen every kind of mistake you can make. And hopefully, we try and avoid each of them as we go through. And so we're still standing. And we're also a qualified sub-trunking provider for Lync Server 2013. So those elements in and of itself give you a sense of the kinds of things we've experienced in this short time. And it's very different than a service provider alone because we have to actually worry about all of the elements, and we've seen all of the issues when somebody rolls it out. We know which firmware you should have on what phone. We know when you should have a particular software upgraded on an SBC or a gateway that might be out there. We know, when things start going strangely, why that signaling might be a little messed up, and be able to get that fixed for you. And we know how to handle your 911 services from there. One other major point to mention, because we have 33 years of voice experience, we carry a large inventory, and we're one of the few stocking distributors for even older refurbished equipment. You can get to a point where if you're doing a deployment and you've got a Nortel system existing, an Avaya system existing, a Cisco system existing that you're picking up and taking out, not only can we provide you the phones on the Lync installation, we'll buy back all that old stuff. All of it. So we just need a bid sheet, and we'll go through and find out exactly how much and give you the value appropriate for it. We'll just ask you to palletize it, and we'll have somebody come pick it up. And then we'll go ahead and go from there. So it really comes down to a couple of things. You need to have, as we talked about, a level of comfort with your implementation. The only way you're going to get there is testing, testing, testing. We can support you in multiple ways there, whether it be through getting you Lync Express for the purpose of testing, or whether or not it be getting you some SNOME phones for the purpose of testing, and being able to push those out into the field. We can provide you the phones for the test side, the SIP trunking if you already have a server in place, any appliances that might be necessary, headsets if your users will accept them, and then also the SBCs and gateway side of things. We can give you all of that piece, but more importantly, you need to be able to be in a place where you're able to continually test all of that. And sometimes we provide testing for stuff, and because of the nature of the relationship between the Microsoft partner that is working with you all and then somebody else, we may not get all the business, right? But the point is that for us to be successful as an ecosystem with Lync, we've got to support you. We've got to support the ability to get some of this equipment out there. And through our manufacturer partners, they support us doing that as well to make sure that we get things out there. So we are effectively done. I've got questions, as many as you like, for the next 15, 20 minutes.
On SIP trunking, the SIP trunking you provide,
Yeah.
is that supplied via point-to-point circuit, or is it right internet with everything?
That's a great question. A few years ago, we would only deploy via circuits directly to the end user. The math is telling us that is actually unless you're a very large enterprise with multiple MPLS networks from a couple of different providers. The math is telling us it's actually now better to use dual, separate public internet connections from primary carriers because the redundancy and capability of the rerouting of that network is stronger and more likely to work rather than relying on the individual access point coming into your building. The actual expectation for a fiber cut or a copper cut coming into the building ends up being higher long-term than what you experience if you have two disparate connections from a public internet connection. Depending on the user interface, too, we also are deploying with customers, call centers up to about 250 or so, 4G routers for the purpose of complete failover, so that if you're in situations where your links do go down, both public internet connections go down that you're connected to, whatever method by which we're reaching you goes down, that you would then have yet even a 4G connection to make sure that critical infrastructure still stays up. So if you're obviously you're in a 1,000-user environment, you're not going to be able to shove that through a 4G router, but you're going to be able to get effectively 12 to 18 calls across that pretty well in most instances. So it's interesting. Best practice, I would have, if 4 years ago, I would have stood up here and I would have railed against public internet access. But the size of it now and the bandwidth capability is, and the cleanliness of it through the core is actually better than what you're going to get in some of the layer 2 networks that are out there today. And let me kind of walk through it. We can get into those weeds if you want to, but walking through that piece. But yeah, I can get into the bits and bytes on the headers of on the layer 2 side, whether or not that makes sense, or 2.5 with an MPLS environment rather than other. But we can also, if you require that, we can of course directly connect into whatever MPLS node you happen to have and deploy it that way, or with a point-to-point circuit if required. No. We can do whatever makes sense for you. We can get to. It comes down to a cost element. You know, it's at some point. Disaster recovery becomes so far. You know, it becomes de minimis as far as its ability to solve a disaster with the amount of money you're throwing at it. You know, so there's an inverse relationship after you start throwing more money. So it just depends on how we run it. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts? Frederick or Tom, you guys have anything to add? No? All right. All right, good. Anybody else? Anything?